The hope from the United States, I think, in a policy sense, is firstly to reduce reliance on China. Um, Secondly, is somehow to enable local firms to meet the needs. And the third thing that I think the hope is that somehow as a result of all of this, there will be a dramatic rejuvenation of American manufacturing.
Hello and welcome to a new podcast from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askary. Today is Thursday, February the 6th. This year, 2025, started on somewhat a positive note with the ceasefire in Gaza, which stopped for a while, for the moment, a horrific war against the people of the population there. We don't know how it will end. But then later, President Trump made his somewhat absurd statements about owning Gaza and removing the people to some other countries, which everybody rejected immediately, including US allies like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan, and others. So the point is that whatever President Trump says and does right now should not be taken deadly serious because things can change. President Trump is his position is inflated by his own victory, and he's reflecting internal American dynamics without understanding the global dynamics that the world has changed since he was president ended his presidency 2020. The world has changed dramatically in every aspect. And therefore, until he meets with President Putin or with President Xi Jinping, he will be back to his normal size, and we might take things up there. But he has already done certain things which have been very damaging, both to the United States, but also to global economy and trade, including the tariffs imposed on several countries, Canada, Mexico, and others. But now that he rolled back that because the effects are destructive for the U.S. economy itself, but also the tariffs imposed on China. China retaliated in kind, and this is a very interesting situation. So anyway, we're going to discuss a number of issues today, but also the implication for the Belt and Road Initiative. But we will talk a lot about China-U.S. relations and U.S. policy. And to do that, I'm honored to have with us today Professor Warwick Powell. He's adjunct professor at the Queensland University of Technology and senior fellow at the Taipei Institute in China. You are based in Australia right now. He is the author of a number of works, including the book China, Trust and Digital Supply Chains, Dynamics of a Zero Trust World. But for people who are interested, they can contact him. We will have the contact to your website and how to communicate with you later. So thank you, Warwick, for being with us. I know it's a bit late now in Australia compared to here in Sweden. It's in the evening, but I really appreciate you took the time to be with us.
It's an absolute pleasure to be with you again.
I don't know what you think about what I said about President Trump, not that we should not take everything he says seriously right now. Whatever, if you have any comment on my introduction, please go ahead.
Look, I think quite clearly the United States political elite, as it is post-election, is trying to navigate its position in the world as it is in 2025, as opposed to the world that it imagined it might have been. And this process of navigation, I think, is a fraught one. It's fraught in large part because, as you mentioned, the world has changed a lot since Donald Trump was in the White House. But it's also fraught because the United States political culture and political elite institutions have actually yet to come to terms with what the fundamental shifts are. And in some respects, they are experiencing a very significant bout of displacement anxiety. The unipolar moment, the 35 years or so after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 is well and truly over. Most people who've been watching and observing and analysing the dynamics of the world came to that view a few years ago. And it's interesting that at this very moment, we have a Secretary of State who has articulated a recognition that unipolarity is over, but I'm not quite sure that that has fully permeated the entire conceptual frame and the cultural attitude that the American political establishment is going to bring to the world and to its own approaches to navigating the state of play. Whether you take Donald Trump at his word is always an interesting question. I perhaps take what he says a little bit more seriously, notwithstanding the hyperbole and the flourishes that often come with it. And I do that because I think it would be a little bit remiss to just dismiss the words that a president of the United States articulates, because in some way they nonetheless reflect a kind of a thought pattern or a intuitive attitude that helps shape his thinking and ultimately the thinking of his administration.
Yes. Yeah, I appreciate your feedback. The matter is that, my view is that reality is not shaped, although the United States has enormous power, but the world is not shaped by only the United States. There's something called reality. And the reality of the world is not decided by the United States. It has been to a great deal decided by what has emerged as the Global South, China's development, China's rise, Asia's rise, the BRICS, and so on and so forth. So people who want to live in reality, they have to take that into consideration. Now, before we go into we were going to discuss the question of the tariffs imposed on China by this US administration. What will be the impact of that? We will discuss also some of the disruptive Chinese technological developments with the DeepSeek AI, big surprise, which wreaked havoc in the American and Western stock markets and high-tech markets. But we also discuss, first of all, and this is the one thing about reality I would like to start with, is this year is 2025. It's the year of the Made in China 2025. This was a plan or a vision, produced by the Chinese government. The State Council in May 2015 issued this plan, which later termed Made in China 2025, that China will become, or will, endeavor to become a world leader in specific technologies. China will be a world leader in very advanced technologies like information technology, automated machine tools, and robotics. That was checked. The first one was checked. The second one was checked. China reached world superiority in this. Aerospace and aeronautical equipment, that's checked. China has now one of the most advanced space programs. Maritime equipment and high-tech shipping, China is now the world dominant power. That's checked. Modern rail transport equipment, that's checked too. We know China has built now 47,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. That's more than the circumference of the planet Earth. But also China has become, in that process, the world leader in producing both rail technology, trains, rolling stocks, and so on. New energy vehicles and equipment. Now China is the world leader in both electric vehicles, but also renewable energy, power equipment, agricultural equipment, new materials. China is now the world, the main source of so-called rare earth metals that are crucial for very advanced technologies. All the world depends on China there, so that was checked. Biopharma and advanced medical products, that's still where actually certain countries like Sweden is still a world leader, and also other European and in the United States. So China still has to, but that China, this is something which Americans used to know. It's called mission orientation. Uh, I discussed this in the recent two articles, China, the Belt and Road, and the World in 2035 on our website. And also in 2021, I wrote this article, why it is important to read the mind of the Chinese leaders, but also why is China ahead of others. So where I discussed this, there's something called mission orientation. This is something Americans used to know in both military affairs, but also in economics. But Americans have forgotten about that, which means, for example, when President John Kennedy in the early 60s said, by the end of this decade, we will put a man on the moon. So all resources of the nation, technological, scientific, industrial, everything, and the passion of the people were directed in one direction to achieve something extraordinary. And this has disappeared. And the United States managed to put a man on the moon in 1969, as Kennedy said, but that has disappeared from the United States. The United States can launch wars, but they cannot build large scale, such fantastic things. China now is the mission orientation world champion. And therefore, they have managed to achieve all these things within 10 years. So I don't know what is your take on this, because this sets the stage for why attempts by the United States and the EU to decouple or to de-risk China, impose sanctions on China will fail. So what is your take on this idea of the Made in China 2025?
Look, I think it clearly shows that when a nation puts its mind to something and harnesses and mobilizes its available resources, that it gives itself a very good chance of achieving those objectives. I think the other interesting thing, and it goes back to your observation about the question of reality, is that the Western world has become fixated with its own sense that it can create reality through narratives. And I often talk about it as a simulacra organ, pumping out, the soothing echoes of imagined realities. But there is a reality, and those realities in the end will make possible certain things and also constrain other things. And it doesn't matter what the narrative is, you've got to confront these realities. And I think part of the grieving process of going through the loss of primacy, the loss of global hegemony, and the confrontation with all of these realities is creating this big gap between what once was and the narrative that seeks to sustain that and what is. The other thing that I think is interesting is that the United States actually, I think, has had a very clear sense of a different sort of mission over the last 35 years. And that mission has been driven largely by its own neoliberal obsessions of global hegemony, prosecuting a particular version of the good life that it believes was necessary and, in fact, an obligation and a right of the United States to push across the world. And it saw that as its main mission. And it was able to do that because it had lulled itself into the belief that history had ended and it was now the dominant power forever and a day. It just had to do the mop-up job around the world. And so that's what it did. It went around the world and created lots of mayhem and disruptions. That process, I think, is also, in a sense, reaching a crossroads. I won't say it's coming to an end because institutionally, and we're seeing that, of course, in the reactions with Gaza or Greenland or Mexico or Canada and what have you, there is still a part of the United States body politic which sees itself as an organization or as an institution, a global institution that needs to push itself onto others and around the world. The Chinese Made in China 2025 game plan, of course, was built on the back of work that was done in the years immediately preceding, that laid the groundwork for what became a cohesive national plan. So in the years immediately before the announcement of the plan, there was already substantial commitments to research and development in core technologies around batteries, which would be necessary if China was to become a leader in a number of the spaces that you identified. The foundational skills that you needed in science and technology, chemical engineering, etc., mathematics, were things that China has been committed to for a long time. You don't just miraculously, through the click of a finger, invent a population that knows a lot of stuff and has a large population that is very educated in these core areas. So, in many ways, what we see today is the fruition of a concerted national effort for many decades to raise not only the basic living standards of a lot of people, but to raise the educational standards of a lot of people, because that in the end is what is enabling China to pursue these other ambitions.
Yeah. This is a very important point, this question of education, because, and as you said, this is not like the Chinese government or leadership snapped their fingers and they made it. That 2025 is part of a very, very long-term mission. This is a stepping stone. The next stepping stone is 2035, and the ultimate step, goal is 2049, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is a much larger and more fantastic aspect. We can't go through that now, but this is the way the Chinese leadership and people think, very, very long term. But then you have these stepping stones in the way. But one thing which you have discussed is in your writings and interviews is this question is that in the West, they say the Chinese cannot innovate, they just copy. And where do they get this thing wrong in this? I mean, we can see all the innovation going on in China, but what is in the misunderstanding about the Chinese culture which make people make such assumptions? Or is it just simple arrogance and ignorance?
Look, for some people, I suspect it is a little bit of that, but I also think that there's a model, a mental model that is at work, which leads people to these sorts of caricaturistic or cartoonish conclusions. And the model runs something like this. Innovation is something that requires creativity. Creativity flourishes in an environment where people can be free, and that environment is provided by a neoliberal political setup epitomized by the United States. Therefore, ipso facto, innovation happens in that context. By way of contrast, the caricature is that Chinese education is rote learning based, it is authority driven, there is no capacity for creative thought, it is discouraged, and therefore, because it's the opposite of that free flowing liberal environment, it therefore cannot be creative and innovative. The experience, of course, of the past many decades is that, in fact, Chinese people, not unlike people anywhere else in the world, have the ability to put their minds to tackling problems by mobilizing available resources in creative ways. That in itself is innovative. Chinese governance for the last 40 years has been a never ending experiment in innovation. They have been continually modifying and changing the ways in which different levels of government interact with each other, the delegations of responsibilities, the particular incentive policies that are adopted here, there, and everywhere. As you know, China is a big country, both geographically and population-wise, and one of the hallmarks of Chinese governance and public policy has actually been the ability and willingness to experiment at large scale, and learn from those experiments and then roll it out nationally. That's all about innovation. It's all about the application of human creativity to identifying problems, analyzing those challenges, looking at the resources available, and then finding pathways to get the outcomes that you want.
Yeah,
So it's a much broader sense of what being innovative and creative means. And I think the issue is that as time's gone on, the dominant narrative has narrowcast this issue of innovation so that we have a mental map that says only certain things count as innovative. And that does no justice to the creative capacities of people all over the world, let alone the achievements of Chinese people. But it also lulls everyone who believes that caricature into a false sense of security that the rest of the world somehow is incapable of being creative and innovative.
Yeah, this sense of false, perception of reality is really, really dangerous because people suddenly woke up to the reality that we are not only going backwards, but that China has leaped forward, and with it, a great part of humanity.
Yeah,
And this is look. I live in the West. We live in Europe. We wish to have a prosperous and peaceful life. We want to have progress and well-being for our people, for our family, my children and my grandchildren. I wish the same for the American people. So our mission is to how to bridge, uh, you know, uh, the aspirations of different nations, different peoples. But this was shown. We will come back to that. Actually, recently, lots of Americans, millions of Americans, got a wake-up call when they had to move from TikTok to a Chinese app, Red Note, to discover for themselves how Chinese people live, how China looks really. So
yeah,
we will take that again, but it's very interesting because we live in the proverbial valley of the clueless here. But now that control of the information, control of knowledge is vanishing gradually. But let's first go to something which happened like last week with the DeepSeek floating its AI open source app, which shocked the not only the stock markets but every level of government planning. And also it's important for people to understand that a great deal of what the United States or the Biden administration or the Trump administration talk about the great growth of the American economy is really not based on any physical realities. It's based on a major financial bubble created by the high-tech companies like the NVIDIA, the chip manufacturers, the social media apps, the X.com, the Facebook, Meta, and so on, and the enormous inflation of the financial value of these conglomerates who are called, I think Yanis Varoufakis calls them as the techno-feudalists who we saw surrounding President Trump during his inauguration, that these are the companies. This fictitious value is the source of what people call growth in the American system. Average Americans have seen their living standards, the infrastructure, the education, the healthcare just degenerating for decades, but more emphatically recently. So now that superiority in tech, which is the basis for claiming America being ahead of everyone else, now has been smashed by the Chinese company, a startup, which I would like you, Warwick, to tell our viewers a bit of the basics of that. I mean, we are not experts in that area, but what did DeepSeek do to make these American stock markets to lose trillions of dollars of value? Can you break it down for us a little bit?
I'll try my best. DeepSeek is a company in China that a couple of weeks ago released to the world its first artificial intelligence model, which has reasoning capabilities. And the release of that model was also accompanied by a particular licensing arrangement, which was an open source licensing arrangement. So a model was released and it was also released as an open source model. Now, what does all of that mean and why did it rock the world? Why was DeepSeek essentially a very big rock thrown into the AI pond? I think it's largely for three reasons. The first reason is that it actually showed that Chinese research and development was capable of successfully undertaking and advancing foundational research. And that's what the DeepSeek model actually did. So that was the first thing that it accomplished, which in many ways I think surprised many in the West that Chinese researchers could do that. Apropos our earlier discussion, there was a view in the West that Chinese technology entrepreneurs were exceptionally good at copying, but not very good at the foundational core research. And whether that's right or wrong, the reality is that this particular project showed that Chinese researchers were capable of these sorts of breakthroughs. Importantly, too, this research was undertaken by a very young team, all of whom were trained and educated in China. Now, that is also an important point of distinction compared to how many technology projects in China have emerged over the last 15 years, which was in the main driven by returning home Chinese people who gained education overseas and then came back to China and pursued their own entrepreneurial ambitions. So the first thing is the foundational research. The second thing, on the back of the foundational research that the DeepSeek model was able to accomplish, was to operate at incredibly low costs. So it was being able to deliver on a like-for-like basis the outputs that its comparable platforms from the United States at a fraction of the price, around 3% of the cost of a comparable platform. So from a pricing point of view, that also rocked the world. And the pricing is a function of the fact that its operating costs are low, which means it's using far less computational capability to achieve the same outcome. And consequently, it's also using far less energy input as well. So that will have a reverberation effect, and it did, into the hardware aspects, namely microprocessors, and also into the energy sector. Because when you realize that you can accomplish the same results with far less computational power and energy than you previously thought or your previous financial models assumed, then you've got to recalibrate your entire model.
There's one important point here, if I may intervene here, is that because the superiority the US AI companies claim to have, which nobody else has, is that this total dominance in the semiconductor area, that they have the most advanced, the most powerful semiconductors and computing machines, which China doesn't have. Also, that this is where the value of the whole chain is, but also it's like one of the big things which were pushed by the new Trump administration is this Stargate, is that they will harness $500 billion in new investments where they investments in the United States to create these massive centers for this AI industry. But what you say is that these DeepSeek and these Chinese companies, they say, well, we don't need all this, big festival. Advanced semiconductors is useful, but you don't need them for all this stuff. You can, with very simple algorithms, achieve the same result with less advanced chips and so on. So this is where. But what does, for people who don't know this AI thing, because I used ChatGPT before, now I use DeepSeek, I'm comparing the two as well. But what do they do? What do these AI things do?
Well, in essence, they take in a lot of data and they are able to process that data, sort that data quickly, find patterns, and ultimately undertake what is called reasoning, which is to work its way through the data based upon requests and prompts given to it by human operators. And the reasoning component's actually quite interesting because if you task the AI with a particular problem to tackle, and you can see the reasoning, sometimes you can see the AI head down a particular path and then backtrack as it realizes that that path's not going to take you to where you want to go. So the computational capability is all about how much data you can process how quickly. Just think of it that way. And what DeepSeek was able to do is demonstrate that you didn't need to have the absolute fastest processing capabilities out there to achieve the results that you wanted. They were able to get a lot more bang for buck from some older equipment. Interestingly, one of the reasons they had to do that is because of the export constraints imposed on those high-end microconductors by semiconductors by the Biden administration. So they created constraints which Chinese innovators had to work around and resolve. The last dimension, which is the piece that I think is likely to, and this is why I think the shock is so great. It's the three prongs or the trifecta. And the third leg in the trifecta is that the license arrangement is open source. What that means is that anybody in the world can download a copy of the model. So it's available on a publicly accessible repository. And you can install the model on local devices. So you can run the model on your own computer. All the way through to running the model on a Raspberry Pi. So a Raspberry Pi is a very low cost computer that you can buy. Typically, it's used for research and education purposes and hobbyists. So a lot of kids who are into electronics use Raspberry Pis to build robots and learn all about electronics and computers. And a Raspberry Pi these days, just a plain computer, no keyboard, no monitor, is in the region of 100 or so US dollars. So we've gotten to a point where somebody can download and run a model, not necessarily the full model, but a light version of the model on a device that's costing you $100 to $200. If you wanted to run the full model, I've seen people and they've provided the shopping list of the hardware that they've used. They've built an optimal hardware configuration to run a full DeepSeek model for about 6,000 US dollars. So that's a remarkable drop in cost, and it transforms accessibility. The other thing is that not only can you run the model, you can then build things on top of the model and change the model as you see fit. In other words, they've provided people with all the Lego blocks, all the building blocks. There's, of course, an instruction sheet to run it as per this particular model, but you can build whatever you want with these tools now. And once people gain the skills and more people gain the skills to make use of these application platforms, they're really platforms. The world is someone's oyster if they can, bring their innovative and creative brains to these tools.
Yeah. That's interesting because this whole AI, this kind of dialogues like the ChatGPT and the DeepSeek and all these others, it's a open source based, which means that, for example, I asked ChatGPT before, I asked DeepSeek, who is Hussein Askary, and I got some very nice feedback. But they use my own website. They use the information I have created on my own, in my own institute. They use interviews I have done with. So they take information which is available everywhere. The only favor they do is they get all of it immediately and they reorganize it and summarize it and give it back to me. But this is all available for free. But what American AI companies are doing, like ChatGPT and others, the Meta, they commodify this information, which they get for free, but then they want you to buy it from them at very high price. And that way they create enormous value for their company, enormous revenues by simply looting the users of
Yeah.
this. And this is the basis for this enormous financial assets that exist in the US stock markets, which is the basis for the growth in the US economy, which is completely fictitious. If you look at the physical economy, the real economy of the United States, living conditions, and so on, they have been degenerating. That gives a false sense of reality for American leaders and politicians, but also a great deal that the American economy is doing well, while it is actually, collapsing in a sense. So what the
Yeah.
DeepSeek and these Chinese guys are doing is that they say, look, you don't need to pay all that money. This is all available for free. You can get it for free. And you have to pay some things for more sophisticated stuff. But this shows a certain difference in perception of reality.
Yeah. Look, it's a change in the business model too, right? So the US big tech sector has in effect been a protected species for the past 40 odd years. It emerged off the back of substantial government financing through DARPA and Defense Department and Pentagon contracting. Silicon Valley today wouldn't be what it is or where it is if it had not been for the ongoing financial support of the American military industrial complex. And so it is a protected species, which then recoups uh, a return on an investment by, in effect, uh, creating artificially scarcity. And doing so prices people out, enables them to push prices up. On the other hand, a business model like DeepSeek is pricing people in by creating abundance. So this is the fundamental business model distinction, if you will, between these two worlds. Now, the American world, which is why people like Yanis Varoufakis talks about it as a techno-feudal environment, is because they are in effect landlords of digital space where they control a whole bunch of on ramps and off ramps and gates and other gadgets in this space. And they charge people for interacting with that infrastructure and that ecosystem. And the reason he calls it feudalism is because they garner rents. And in a technical sense, rents are above average profits. And they can garner above average profits because there is no competition. Now, the minute you introduce intense competition into a space and incentivize abundance, you will have a transformed way in which a political economy operates. The US financialization has in large part been driven by um, a, a, a progressive growth in the money supply, both from the federal government and also from commercial banks over the last 40 years, which has outpaced the value creation of the American domestic economy. And as fixed capital relocated overseas, that money capital that had been created and is now in circulation had to go somewhere else. And it ends up in places like the stock exchange, derivative markets, foreign exchange markets, and the like. And we generally call those things fictitious capital. And they're fictitious because they are a claim on a future revenue right, as opposed to the parts of the economy which are the real value. And there are, real value is doesn't have to be physical or tangible per se, but it is real value because it involves the satisfaction of real requirements and needs. So, for instance, getting a massage is still a real economy activity because it involves the exertion of energy and effort, even if it isn't making something that I can take home. But that is very different from a fictitious capital product, which is nothing more than a right to something in the future. And once you've created these markets, they're saying what happens is that as money supply grows and there's more liquidity in the system, instead of going into building more factories and investing in machines and investing in people, it actually ends up in these markets and trades because you can monetize profits quicker and easier through trading activity than you could any day of the week by building a factory and running a factory. And the fictitious world and the technology world go glove in hand, hand in glove, because it enables the creation of these quasi-monopoly or highly protected environments where the business model is to become market dominating. So you'll hear in the world of venture capital and private equity, and if you read the literature on startups, the objective of a business model is to prove to a potential investor how you will dominate the market, right? Not how you will deal with competition, but how you will crush competition and become a monopoly.
Right.
That's the objective. And when that's your business model, and then you plug onto that a stock exchange, well, the inevitable outcome is money capital will continue to pour into that part of an economic system at the expense of the rest. And this is exactly what's happened in the United States for over 40 years. The problem is that when the foundations of that model come under pressure, all of those people who hold their monetary wealth in these instruments are now wondering what they do. And this is a problem for the wealthy, by the way, because the American Stock Exchange today has 93% of the market capitalized wealth of the stock exchange is owned by 10% of people. And half of that is owned by 1%. Right? So the monetization of the US economy has come hand in hand with growing income disparities and wealth disparities, where ownership of fictitious capital has enabled the monetized enrichment of a smaller and smaller group.
Right. Yeah.
And this is where we're at now.
Exactly. So we're going away from this fictitious world. We go to the final part of our discussion on the reality, because in this so-called trade war, I mean, many people, President Trump talks about President William McKinley and so on and so forth. But the difference is that you have, at the time, you had nascent American industries growing. You have protective tariffs, which is legitimate. Any nation has the right to impose protective tariffs to protect its nascent industries, especially against big powers like the British Empire at the time. But to punish, have punitive tariffs against others, while you don't have the industries that can supplement that what you try to keep away, that the United States today does not have the industries, it does not have the production, industrial and technological capacity, engineering capacity, and the skilled labor to compensate for loss of Chinese products. So you are shooting yourself in the foot, basically. But what we have, you can comment on that, but going to the question of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is our major, is that in the recent years, China has shifted away from reliance on the American and the EU markets as the major markets, but also economic partners, to the Global South. That there are other economic centers in the world that are emerging that China considers as its future, economic partnership and markets where things will grow, and even more equitable and more respectful kind of cooperation. And the question of the supply chains is that the first decade of the Belt and Road Initiative was characterized by large-scale infrastructure building, which is very necessary because without transport, power, and water and skilled labor, you cannot have economic growth. But now China is also spreading the supply chains over greater areas in the Global South, like starting industrial parks. Chinese companies are starting industrial parks in Africa, besides the ASEAN countries, in Central Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, and so on and so forth, closer to the markets. And of course, using less costly labor force and raw materials. So there is a shift now going on as a precaution against these trade wars. So how do you see this, the question of supply chains? Can the United States and the EU afford not to deal with China and work with China? And number two, how will this shift towards the global south will affect the whole global economic situation?
Let's put it into a bit of a long context so that we can drill in as we get closer to today. After the Second World War, the US economy was, in effect, the last economy left standing, and it supplied about 50% of the global GDP. At about that time, trade, American trade, imports and exports, comprised about 25% of global trade. So it was a very significant and dominating player 75, 80 years ago. Come forward to today, and the US economy occupies, let's say, somewhere in the region of roughly 15% of global GDP. So I'm just round numbers, but just gives us a sense of proportionality. So it's gone from 50% to 15 as a proportion. And from a trade point of view, it's also about 15% of global trade as well. So it's gone from 25% of global trade to 15% of global trade. On both measures, the United States economy is no longer, in relative terms, as important as it was once before to the global economy. In large part, of course, that's not because the United States economy shrunk. It's actually because the rest of the world has grown faster over that period of time. And we now have a point where the patterns of trade over the last 10 to 15 years have changed, so much so that China is now the largest trading partner of 140, 150 countries in the world, whereas the picture was the opposite 30 years ago. The United States was the largest trading partner. And Chinese trade now contributes somewhere in the order of 15% or thereabouts of global trade as well, from memory, something like that. But what's interesting about these changes of the patterns of trade is that as the significance of America has diminished, obviously the significance of China has grown, but it's the significance of the rest of the world has grown as well. Of America's trade, about half of that, a little bit more than half, with the EU, Japan, Korea, and Australia, so the classic Western allies markets, and a bit less than half is with the rest of the world. So I mention all of that to paint a picture, which is that the United States economy is not as important today as it once was. It's not to say that it's small and not important. It's just not as important as it once was. And from a trade point of view, it's also not as important as it once was. That means that the tariffs that are being imposed or that are being talked about are less likely to be as effective today as perhaps it might have been in a previous era. And the reason is that the rest of the world is far less dependent from a trade point of view on the United States market than it was in the past. So when Donald Trump speaks about, we'll stop you from selling to the beautiful American market, maybe 15, 20 years ago, that threat of the loss of that market was something that would cause supply chains to shudder and enterprises to shudder. But today, they don't shudder in the way that they once did. Now, I've done some recent work which would suggest that the BRICS countries, the expanded BRICS countries of the 10 members, would probably, all of them, would adapt to the total loss of the American market in the space of about 2.5 years. And that is accomplished through a combination of organic growth, which is the existing rates of growth in trade amongst themselves anyway, together with some coordination on fiscal policy to boost a bit of local domestic demand. So you put all of that together, and the short answer to your question, or actually the short answer at the end of the long preamble to your question, is that the rest of the world, I think, can adjust. That's not to say that there won't be adverse impacts, because all adjustment processes involves dislocations and the expense of resources that you would otherwise not have to, and disruptions and pain. So that's the rest of the world piece. The America piece, I think, is interesting as well. Of course, America can adjust as well. Of course it will. That's what happens to places. The question is how quickly can it adjust and in what ways? And what are the implications of the processes of adjustment? Now, as you mentioned, the United States economy doesn't have the capacity to produce many of the things that it consumes as part of its, daily life, but not just daily life, actually as part of its economic system, the production system itself. Of its imports from China, about 40% are actually intermediate goods. So we're not just talking about end consumer goods coming into the United States, but intermediate goods and capital goods. So the United States would need to adjust. It can't produce things quickly itself, so it will need to buy them from somewhere else. It'll turn to other countries. Now, the irony of doing that, we've already seen this happen over the last 6 years, is that as they turn to other countries, what they'll actually find is a bunch of Chinese companies setting up in other countries. So whilst they're reducing proportionately what they're importing from China or companies in China, they're actually going to maintain their levels of imports from the rest of the world, and many of that will come from Chinese firms anyway. Now, from a geopolitical point of view, you'd hardly call that a gold medal approach, because what they've actually done is hastened the expansion of the Chinese capital footprint across the globe anyway, which enables China to boost its relationships with all of these countries, contribute to economic development, build better relationships, etc., etc. So that's the first part of the American adjustment. The second part, of course, is the shortage of goods will lead to price increases. The price increases could conceivably be offset in all sorts of other ways, for instance, by increasing money supply to give people, put more money into the system so that there's more spending power to overcome the shortages. But there will be, as a first round effect, some inflationary consequence. The hope from the United States, I think, in a policy sense, is firstly to reduce reliance on China. Secondly, is somehow to enable local firms to meet the needs. But as we've discussed, there's actually not a lot of spare capacity locally in these things. And so they'll be importing them from other places. And the third thing that I think the hope is that somehow as a result of all of this, there will be a dramatic rejuvenation of American manufacturing. Now, after the tariffs of Trump 1.0, there have been quite a number of studies done which confirms really that there has been negligible impact on the rejuvenation of American manufacturing, both in output terms, which have remained basically flat for the last 10 years, and employment terms, which is the big political problem, right? And which incidentally, employment in manufacturing as a proportion of total employment in America has also been pretty flat. It hasn't continued declining. It reached its level a decade or so ago, and it's been pretty much where it's at since. Now, if it's going to rejuvenate manufacturing, it's going to firstly need to import a lot of capital goods. It doesn't have them. So the irony of all of this is that it's going to need to boost its deficit so as to reduce its deficit in the future. If it's not going to import those capital goods from China, it'll import them from Chinese companies in other countries, or it will import much more expensive capital goods from Germany, Japan, and Korea. That's what's going to happen. The second thing is that that all takes time. And it's not going to create the kind of jobs that are being promised, right? For the heartland, the jobs for the working classes that were displaced over the last 50 or so years, who've been left on the pile by the American political establishment as Wall Street soared, right? Main Street basically came down to a crawl, and they've never done anything to invest in the human capital of these displaced communities. So they're going to be investing in new capital equipment. That new capital equipment won't create the jobs for the people who've been displaced. Unfortunately, that new capital equipment and the new production processes will be highly automated. Now, that will create other kinds of jobs, except those kinds of jobs need people with high levels of literacy and numeracy skills, as well as education levels that currently in America don't exist. So you've got a human resources capability problem then. And we're starting to see that in the efforts to bring TSMC to establish chip fabs in Arizona. One of the reasons the project's been delayed is because of insufficient skilled labour. There's just not enough of the right kinds of skills in the national economy in America to actually support the development of these sorts of ecosystems. So there's a lot of adjustment challenges that the United States would need to deal with, none of which happens overnight. So what happens in the meantime, Hussein? Well, let's say the United States can make the adjustment in a decade. Let's just say that. Well, during the course of that period, a lot of people will be adversely affected through inflation and also the potentially loss of jobs as a result of inflation driving businesses to be less competitive, etc. So the adjustment pain for the United States is going to be not insignificant. The fundamental reason why reindustrializing is a real problem in America is not just the fact that it needs to import capital equipment. It's not because it needs to invest in human beings so that they've got better skills and better education. It's fundamentally for the reasons we discussed earlier, and that is the increased monetization or the financialization of the American political economy. Because it was the financialization of the political economy that caused the progressive reduction in capital formation in manufacturing. So unless you tackle financialization, there are no structural incentives for money capital to go to capital formation in industrial production systems, as opposed to staying in the world of fictitious capital. That's a structural problem in the political economy of the United States.
Yeah.
So you've got practical problems at a raw materials resourcing level, capital equipment, intermediate goods. You've got practical problems with educational standards and literacy and numeracy. And then you've got this big structural problem, which is the composition of capital in the political economy. Unless you tackle all three, you're not going to get to the point where the American political elite seem to want to get to.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is very, very enlightening. Of course, we are talking about a world where it will be divided. But the issue is now, I mean, we wrote about this in early 2023, before Huawei came with their big surprise when they developed their own chips to produce the Huawei ProMate 60. Before that, we wrote about this, an article that, the physical entanglement of the global supply chains. It's physically impossible to do what you are suggesting, that the United States will reindustrialize. It's physically impossible. There should be a complementarity at best between the strong aspects of American industry or technology with China or Europe. I will give you one example. I mean, to confirm what you said about why these things are difficult. The question is that we are not only buying consumer goods from China. The Swedish labor unions and manufacturing labor unions, they issued a very interesting report, and it had a provocative title. It said, "Thank China for the rise in your wage." And there's a very long scientific study behind this. He's the head of the person who made the study. He goes through how Chinese high quality but lower cost intermediate goods are imported by Swedish industries and then incorporated in machinery and finished products with a much higher added value.
Yeah.
So there's a complementarity. We should complement each other. We should not compete with China in areas where China is super powerful. Sweden used to build nuclear power plants domestically. That generation is either retired or dead. We cannot build nuclear power plants using Swedish domestic as we used to do in the 50s and 60s. So there is this issue that if we are going to survive in a world of cooperation and coexistence, we can take our superior areas and not compete with China everywhere, but we can compete and complement areas where we are strong, rather than competing with China in areas and industries where China is strong. So this is the dilemma now, because we physically cannot disengage from China, we cannot disengage from the global South and end up in this divided world. So there is an existential issue, actually, if we're going to manage to get into some sort of understanding between the United States and China, between Russia and Europe, and so on and so forth, because we are totally interdependent. Everybody knows what happened to German and European industries when the gas from Russia was stopped. So there's this dilemma now, and people have to think deeply about that.
Look, something that I guess I think about a little bit is this issue of the American transition and what that may or may not look like. And part of the answer, of course, is being able to create an environment where the capabilities that now exist in places like China can be mobilized to accomplish things in the North American continent. And you see being thrown around proposals of, 50-50 joint ventures. And in fact, President Trump at a rally in the election campaign early last year, talked about the bloodbath in the motor vehicles world if the Chinese EVs came into the North American market, but then said, but he'd welcome Chinese companies setting up in America, employing Americans. Now, that's all a bit rough around the edges, but there is a general issue there, which is, well, is there the capacity in the American political economy and its cultural institutions to embrace the idea of Chinese know-how and Chinese technologies setting up shop in North America? Of course, it's been done already in things like buses and producing solar panels and all sorts of other things. But that took place in a slightly different time when there was less sensitivity, emotional sensitivity. The question is whether or not a political establishment can help calm the nerves of a population and bring a totally out of control political system down to earth to be able to engage practically around what the real objectives are. And the real objectives have got to be maintaining high quality of life for people in a high quality urban or non-urban environment. Now, you notice that I say that they're the objectives as opposed to maintaining American hegemony or American primacy, because they aren't the objectives anymore. Those objectives can't be accomplished. That's over. So what should be the mission today? Well, the mission should be, high quality living standards for people. That should always be the objective. That's the mission. And then you work backwards from that mission. How do we accomplish that? China hasn't been the reason why Americans have experienced a relative decline in their living standards. America's living standards began to suffer as American industry hollowed out and as Wall Street expanded over the last 40 years. All of this happened 20 plus years before China came into the World Trade Organization. China has not caused the decline of American industry. It hasn't brought about the hollowing out of industry. That's been brought about by the financialization of the American political model. And if there is one thing that I think would aid the Americans a lot, is if the body politic could come to grips with the fact that that is actually the source of the problem. And if they can diagnose the problem and accept it as the problem, then they're halfway there to actually solving it. In the meantime, flapping around, blaming everyone else, portraying yourself as the victim, when of course for 100 years America's been anything but the victim, just doesn't wash anymore. And I do hope that people in America, and I don't mean the ordinary people, because I think ordinary people are very grounded by and large, but the political elite can actually bring themselves to owning their own problems, making peace with themselves domestically, because when they do that, then they will finally be able to make peace with the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Warwick. That was a very good note to end on. Hopefully, we will see people getting more sober and understand reality, but also more human and visionary in their sense that what really matters is to improve the living standards of the people, live in peace, and communicate with other people. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today, and looking forward to new opportunities to talk to you.
A pleasure indeed. Great to see you again.
Thank you.